Welcome everyone. This is kind of a review of the first cultural competency session and also an extension on into the second one. Uh, so we're going to basically just cover some basic components of what we actually even mean by cultural competency. We're going to be creating a webinar. And so the recording of this will just be, us pretty much. And then I will probably at times stop and get your input because that's what this is. We're building a community. So as I started to say, basically, the idea of cultural competency is kind of a term that is now becoming kind of coming into mainstream. And it's because of the ambiguity of culture that it actually is relevant, because it doesn't define things based on race or specific things. It basically says cultural competency is all those things. It's intersectional identity, it's race, and it's also recognizing, as we say, if we talk about anti-racist education or gender bias education, we would have a mindset based on where we live and not necessarily a fully encompassing global perspective. And so the idea of cultural competency is that we put ourselves in the pool of the larger context, which is a world, a planet, and recognize that we all have kind of varying degrees of these cultural illnesses that have been passed on over centuries. So one of my favorite quotes that I think relates to what we're going through right now as educators is a Martin Luther King quote that is very often not quoted. And to me, I think it's one of the most profound things he's ever, that he said is, "The hope of a secure and livable world lies with disciplined non-conformists who are dedicated to justice, peace, and brotherhood." And so the idea of disciplined nonconformity is sometimes we kind of overlook that idea. We have to be disciplined, we have to be educated, whatever, but we also have to be willing to be nonconformist. Everything in our educational system basically came into being over the course of roughly 800 years. Leading up from the from post-Crusades period and the beginning of university institutions in and around the Christian churches in Europe. And then in the case of public education, which is what the university and colleges are modeled off of, it was based on industrialization. So it was based on this standardization of education based on the concept of intelligences that had evolved out of pushing people through this kind of one-size-fits-all form of education. And to be able to counter that and get into the area of a fully globally competent education system that undoes the hierarchies of biases and prejudices and mindsets of value, we have a lot of work to do, and that discipline nonconformity is critical. So how does this translate to education? What are we missing as educators? Well, clearly we're missing something, because as we look at the world we're in right now and we look at what is going on, there is something missing from our education. And so it is priorities, it is the way we're looking at mindsets and skill sets as being kind of secondary to content. And it is obviously this industrial formula based on disciplinary separation and a whole variety of things that move us away from what we call cultural competency education. And the synonym for that is DEJI, which is diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion education. So these are really, they're almost brothers and sisters of each other. I don't know how you could say one without the other. Okay, so at the end of this, we're going to extend an invitation to yourself and then to anybody else who's interested, that we continue to dialogue this, because as you see as we go through this, cultural competency is not something we get. It's not something you arrive at. We don't graduate from. We just have to continue to work on it. And so that's the beauty of having all of us in together. We need psychologists, and we need sociologists, and we need certainly artists, which is my field, is ethnomusicology. And we need all these people together, as well as our STEM brothers and sisters as well. So let's go ahead and we'll start into this and we'll see where this goes. So what is cultural competency? Just in kind of, overall terms, it's an objective and informed and non-biased perspective of a culture or demographic based on immersion on their terms. And then it ultimately has to be sustained over our lifetime. So there's no expiration date on this. A good example that I like to give is one time I did a tour for UNESCO in South America, and we were there for 10 months, and I was learning Spanish and hanging out with all these people. We went to every country but Brazil and the Guyanas, which was unfortunate because I really wanted to get to Brazil. And I was relatively up on the politics. There was a coup when we were in Bolivia for some reason. I don't even know, what they were fighting about, but I was relatively up. And then over a period of time, I was talking like I was up because I'd been there for 10 months. And then progressively, I realized they'd moved on. And all of these cultures, the demographics, everything had moved on. And so I was no longer competent. I had lost my competency because I didn't have kind of those pipelines and those incentives for hanging out for those groups. So is cultural competency an outcome? Is it attainable, Sherry?
I would say it's a work in progress, a lifetime work in progress.
Yeah, yeah, and the thing and just exactly the way you said that, it's a lifetime work in progress, meaning we have to foster that mindset, and of course that goes against our kind of entrenched desire to have answers and outcomes, to be able to go ahead and have this kind of definitive monolithic approach to truth and variety, which science has promoted, particularly in the context of standardized testing and outcomes and things like this. Process learning and basically what cultural competency demands is a mindset that is kind of in opposition to this idea that we can graduate, that we can get a singular outcome. And it also goes against authority, which is a patriarchal construct that we'll talk about, as you're well aware. So who is culturally competent? And obviously the answer is none of us. And to all the regions of the world and all races, based on intersectional identities and whatever, none of us can claim this. So really, it's more a matter of a mindset to desire and a passion for wanting to increase our cultural competency more than the belief that that can be attained. And it's not something contrary to what we would like to think, that if we get a PhD or we're really this or we're really objective and open-minded in one area, that we can claim cultural competency by virtue of that objectivity, because it is not something that can be claimed. It actually has to be lived. And so it's better to actually claim that we're not, so that we have a better chance of becoming than claiming we are, because that flies in the face of cultural competency education. All right, so here's a couple of things. We'll just kind of go over some main points that relate to cultural competency. And again, I remind you, diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion, DEJI, is kind of the acronym that we use. Diversity, by the way, is kind of an ism. Diversity has always been, and it will always be as long as human beings are different. And so that is not as an actionable a term as concerns education. Equity, justice, and inclusion, however, are more actionable. That is, to be equitable and to be inclusive, we actually have to become culturally competent. And most certainly, to become just or justice-based in our education, we have to actually work on that too. So I would just say, of the four terms, those last three require a little bit more kind of in the trenches kind of working. So first of all, the demands of global vision are that we unmask what we call hidden curriculum. And hidden curriculum are all the premises of value and all the beliefs of authority and all the beliefs of privilege and whatever that are embedded in all of our visions of success and whatever. It's one of the things that we hear right now, particularly in the political realm, which I want to try to avoid. But but it is, yeah, exactly. We'll sidestep this, but the demands of global vision are that we unmask hidden curriculum, and hidden curriculum is literally embedded. We don't just mean in our curriculum, but we also mean our mindsets and our beliefs and values. It places an emphasis on immersion learning, as you know, that I can go ahead and study a culture and I can intellectually process information about a culture, but living there and being there require that kind of cultural humility, which we'll talk about as kind of a prereq. And so immersion learning also allows us to be in places and spaces where we're not comfortable until that becomes comfortable. And so as pertains to cultural competency, the kind of the psychology of immersion learning is that we learn to embrace discomfort until eventually we become comfortable with discomfort. And then we embrace mindsets and processes over outcomes. And of course, this is just in opposition to almost all of our assessment processes and almost all of our grading processes and all the things. And most of us as instructors, Sherry, as you know, is like when the people come to you and they say, you're talking about these wonderful ideas of psychology and whatever, and you're just hoping that they'll embrace them and put them into their lives. And then they come and say, so I missed a point on this and I don't understand this answer. And they start arguing points with you. And it's like your head just wants to go. and And so the idea of mindsets over outcomes is really critical. And so which mindsets are we particularly interested in? Well, I think this will grow. But I would say three that I like to focus in on are growth mindset, particularly as relates to other cultures, not just in terms of our perception of intelligence, which, as you know, Dweck basically talked about in terms of intelligence, that we have multiple intelligences and multiple ways of exuding that. But a growth mindset to cultures is that all cultures have what we call cultural assets. And those cultural assets need to be included in our education. And if they're not, we're likely to be culturally centric. Or exceptionalist in our vision of intelligence. Grit is that ability to lean in, so we can't obviously undo racism unless we're willing to go ahead and lean into the possibility that we are racist and that we have racist tendencies, and those are embedded in all of our constructs. And the same thing goes with gender biases and gender privilege and whatever. And so basically that grit is that willingness to lean in and become uncomfortable. And then last but not least, what evolved out of is a common term in the nursing profession, a medical profession, but now is kind of transferring over to education, is cultural humility, which is the willingness to put others ahead of ourselves and to embrace other cultures. And we look at that based on kind of the hierarchy of wherever we're at. So I'm going to kind of go into that in just a bit. So we center justice on our vision of the unique hierarchies and historical profiles and injustices and balances wherever we are. So the educational centerpiece of us in the United States should obviously focus on the hierarchy of injustice based on proportion and imbalance. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's the Newton's law of physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, if we apply this principle to education, and particularly to cultural competency education, we begin the process of placing those cultures that are statistically and in hierarchies and in every way, shape, or form are in the back of the room. We begin to place them in the front of the room. So our native cultures are obviously statistically in the lowest position, followed by our African American cultures and Latinx cultures, and then all of the demographics that basically are intersectional, which includes women in all capacities, and then abilities and diverse abilities. These have to begin to be front-loaded. And the key for that, when we say educational centerpieces, is we not only put emphasis on having them become instructors and teachers and students and active in all facets of our administration, but we also give them the keys to the car. And we allow them to determine how this is done. So if I have, as an example, someone like yourself, and I give you an administrative position, but then I basically create an environment where we want you to act like men in the manner by which you run your position or whatever, we're basically taking the keys away from you and saying, yes, we have women that are in position of value and power, but we're not allowing you to do it based on your aesthetics and values. So any comments or thoughts on that? I'm sure you can.
Only that I can relate exactly to what you said from my previous, employment. Um, I don't need to be a number that they can check off a box. It's more about I bring something unique based on that. And so if you're going to bring me in, then let me use those skills and that knowledge and that experience.
Yeah, exactly. And not only unique, but most needed. In other words, the empathy, we'll get into this in a little bit, but Kevin Locke, Tokeya Inaji, and he's a Lakota native musician that we're going to talk about. But he talks about the moral courage of women, and he talks about that women have this ability to see things in completely different construct because it's not centered on competition. It's centered on the thriving and the well-being of their children, the people that they gave birth to, the people that they bring into the world, the people that they educate, their empathy, all these characteristics and qualities that women have to a heightened degree. And so very clearly we need to have that in, or obviously we can't reverse this kind of competitive, arrogant set of mindsets that we inherited out of imperialism. So yeah. Okay, so we'll kind of go through this, but acquiring competency on the spectrum of diversity education, equity, justice, and inclusion education is a lifelong process. We achieve it in onionic layers, which is a term that we just got made up, but it's like literally peeling literally the onion, and we have to make this be okay. We have to normalize this, and again, I think women and people of color tend to understand process orientation to a greater degree. They tend to lean in to cultural humility to a greater degree. And if they lean into those qualities, they're going to also lean into the ability to make to be able to lay out our weaknesses and lay out our incompetencies in order to become competent and normalize that, rather than go into those meetings. You've been in those meetings where everybody's like one-upmanship and everybody's, no, I know more than you. Yeah, that's not working too well, is it? Okay, so, and again, the last thing is it's attainable only in direct proportion to both our motivation and our sustained effort. So cultural competency is, the more motivation we have and the more we sustain our effort, the more we'll eventually move in that direction, never actually getting there. All right, so one of the things I love, and obviously, Sherry, is children. That there's a reason children learn languages better than adults, and there's a wonderful journal, the Language Teaching Research Journal, which has all kinds of studies that talk about the parameters and the mindsets that children bring in before we teach and learn it out of them, and. And so obviously the primary qualities is they don't yet know that mistakes are not the worst things that you can make. They're willing to go ahead, and you put them in a room, 5 children, all who speak different languages, and if you could find a way to make sure they have food and everything is fine and whatever, they probably come out in a week or two speaking each other's language, because there's nothing preventing them from imagining that this is not possible. And so what happens over time is, as we begin to go ahead and funnel people through this standardized assessment process and this grade and outcome process in the interest of making sure that 30 students all get an equitable grade and that we meet our outcomes, we begin to funnel people out of their natural ability to make mistakes and embrace mistakes. And of course, this is the worst thing that we can possibly do, particularly as relates to cultural competency. There's no way that cultural competency can be acquired if we're not training this mindset of, yes, make mistakes and thrive in that, and then keep that alive until they get into adulthood. So yeah, I'm kind of preaching to a choir here, but I know. So we haven't yet trained them that mistakes are the worst things they can make. And so clearly that's one of the reasons why children, so I always basically try to say, and I constantly emphasize this with my classes, not that I actually am able to convince them of this, but we try to encourage them as adults to bring the child to the party. Because if we're making assignments where they can't do that, then we can't say, well, why aren't you learning this just for you? And why are you constantly talking about points and grades? Because we're not giving them the ability to go ahead and do that. Go ahead, Sherry.
No, you are preaching to the choir. Absolutely. Something that shifted in my own experience, and I try to share with my students, is that you learn far less when you're trying to achieve a grade than if you just focus on the excitement of learning something new. Right. It naturally sticks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so again, we'll have plenty of time to work this, especially if we can build a learning community around this, which is of course our goal. So in a case like that, yeah, if they're in there and they're doing it for passion, and then we can create a part of our grade linked to the amount of passion they demonstrate, the amount of investment they show, then we're basically honoring them for that. Okay, they may come up with the wrong answers, but they've invested themselves and they're likely to take what they've learned from you and apply it to their lives, which means now they'll carry it forward. And that's, of course, where learning actually takes place. So we have to figure out how to do this. And particularly as relates to other cultures and equity, this is something that we have to continue to kind of mainstream in. It's a process, it's not an outcome. Yeah. Okay, so good. The #1 TED Talk of all time, you know what it is?
No.
Okay, it's Ken Robinson's Do Schools Kill Creativity? So I'm going to go ahead and play just a little 6-minute segment of this because there's a reason it is the #1 TED Talk of all time. This segment doesn't do justice necessarily to the whole TED Talk or even to some of the topics, but at least it'll be an introduction. So here we go. If this plays, yep. You hear that?
What these things have in common, you see, is that kids will take a chance. If they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. Our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability. And there's a reason. The whole system was invented around the world. There were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy is rooted on two ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work are at the top. So you were probably steered benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked, on the grounds you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice. Now, profoundly mistaken. The whole world is engulfed in a revolution. And the second is academic ability, which has really come to dominate our view of intelligence because the universities designed the system in their image. If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And I think we can't afford to go on that way. In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. More people. And it's the combination of all the things we've talked about, technology and its transformational effect on work, and demography and the huge explosion in population. Suddenly, degrees aren't worth anything. Isn't that true? When I was a student, if you had a degree, you had a job. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. And I didn't want one, frankly. So, but now, kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video games, because you need an MA, where the previous job required a BA, and now you need a PhD for the other. It's a process of academic inflation, and it indicates the whole structure of education is shifting beneath our feet. We need to radically rethink our view of intelligence. We know three things about intelligence. One, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things.
So I'm going to just stop it there, but basically what we're looking at. Hi, Michelle. Michelle is a music instructor as well. Sherry is a psychology teacher. Both of you guys are compatible spirits, as you'll see, because yeah, go ahead. Sherry, tell us a little bit about yourself, actually. Would you just...
Oh, no, it's okay. I just really related to some of what was said. And then also, hi, Michelle, because that was my undergraduate degree, was violin performance.
Whoa,
So,
great. Oh, great.
at least one of them. Then I also got an undergrad, psych degree, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So tell me what you related to in terms of in terms of this. What things stuck out to you?
Oh, actually, very specifically, when I'm trying to remember when the music thing popped in my head. He was talking about creativity. I don't really remember exactly what it was that triggered it, but I'm like, I can relate to that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Don't do that because you won't get a job and this and that and whatever.
That's the one.
And so
Thank
later
you.
on,
Yes.
his principle is that problem solving and creativity and artistry are the mindsets that allow us to go into every profession and be creative problem solvers, be that disciplined nonconformist that we were talking about. So it's true, you may not get a living as a violinist or as a musician, but by being a musician or being an artist and having that mindset of being a disciplined nonconformist, being willing to lean in and go into places where other people are fearful, you develop those mindsets that allow you to go into any profession and largely prosper. Plus, of course, you get to balance your lifestyle because not everything becomes about paying bills and,
Yes.
So yeah, so good. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Whoops, I don't know what I just did, but whatever it wasn't what I wanted to do. So, okay, so let's see if we can okay, so what are we looking at? We're looking at what we call hidden curriculum. And so the kind of, what can I say? I'm going to get rid of this. I got this thing hanging over there. Sorry about this. I'm trying to like minimize this. So placing what we don't know and embracing mistakes and our own biases in first position has a really rough go in a competitive, patriarchal, and capital-driven societies. And so what we have to understand is pretty much everything that we've come to value is driven by the very mindsets that run in the face of cultural competency and those qualities we talked about growth mindset and grit and cultural humility. And so here's a couple of things that basically kind of support this. This is from the American Corporate Capitalism, an article on American corporate capitalism from the Psychology of American Capitalism. And it basically talks about ACC, or American corporate capitalism, underlies assumptions of value in all areas. A common quote that was used basically as kind of the mantra for what it is that is valuable or important is that the pursuit of self-interest through competition provides the best means for ensuring economic growth, happiness, and good of the community. And so we can see in all of those things kind of the opposite of what is needed to be culturally competent, to become flexible, to become strong community members, to put children and women and people of color, in first position, to do all the things that really actually build honest happiness and honest good community. And so we're kind of flying in the face of something that has been operational. And of course, then to see that this has hundreds and hundreds of years of reinforcement. I liken this to somebody who has two arms and has been working one arm out for centuries. And so by virtue of that, this arm is so strong, and it's basically the arm of imperialism and conquest and patriarchy. This arm is so strong. Religious exceptionalism, unfortunately, is the overarching or overlapping of religious kind of piousness and self-righteousness onto imperialism. And of course, these things, when you combine these things and then you reinforce them over time, over centuries, you arrive at a place where we kind of call what we call a cocktail of arrogance, which is sort of the opposite of what is necessary to reach that place where we are open to other cultures, and particularly open to placing the people that need to be in first position to make the transformation to diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion. So imperialism, patriarchy, and religious exceptionalism create a cocktail of arrogance so implicit and entrenched in Western cultures that it defines hidden curriculum in virtually all the world's hierarchies and the scaffolding of privilege and culture bias, no less so in the university. As we talked about, the hierarchy of disciplines and the emphasis placed on disciplines. I'm fighting with some faculty at the University of Michigan right now who are STEM teachers who haven't learned to be able to take their foot off the gas and recognize we're in a global pandemic, and what they're requiring of their students is sucking all the oxygen out of the air for the rest of the classes, because they haven't recognized it's not about getting to the same milestones and getting the same thing. Now we have to go ahead and just kind of step back and say, wait a second, how much math or chemistry do they really need right now? And how do I make this enjoyable so that they actually take it with them when they leave the class? Maybe I don't get to all my milestones, but maybe I can find a better way to do that so that they embrace themselves and the learning of this beyond the classroom and the application of this beyond the classroom. So let me just pause for a second. Any thoughts, comments?
I'm following. I love it.
Okay, good. All right, good. So I'll just continue on. So when we look at hidden curriculum, it's very important when we look at like current events to be able to factor in hidden curriculum into the current events. It's very easy, especially for our students, but I think also for us as instructors, to look at things that are occurring and kind of look at the moment and look at the outcome and not see the cause. So I would normally say, who could tell a story of your worst bias, your mild, and embarrassing action? I love to tell these stories, particularly as a white male. I have to do it frequently because I have to remind myself that I am very, very prone to taking on the mindsets of privilege that have been indoctrinated in thousands of years of history. And so by me telling my embarrassing moments and kind of emphasizing those in my classroom, it's also a reminder to me to go ahead and constantly stay in that humble position and to realize that I'm very prone to saying something but walking out and acting differently. And so, just to kind of like look at this very quick. If I bring my child learner to all of the current events and to the things that are there, I back away from authority, and I redefine intelligence in the context of the people that are generally being abused by all the things that are going in society. So if we look at, as an example, the picture on the left, the Standing Rock situation was one where the pipeline was coming down from the north, going through the Standing Rock, which is the Lakota reservation in South Dakota. And it was running right through, and these large oil corporations felt that they could go ahead and get away with this because they had been getting away with this for centuries. And what is really significant about this is that this was one of the first times that non-native people stood up with native people to make the voice loud enough that finally somebody said, okay, you can't just get away with this. We're going to make this visible. And as you know, for 300 years before that, nobody stood up on behalf of native cultures. So the cause and effect there is that we understand the history and we don't just look at current events as being current events. And of course, the same thing goes with Black Lives Matter. Any form of justice and equity requires that we are able to go ahead and place the people in first position that have not been in first position. And that's why Black lives right now do matter more. And they have to matter more until all lives matter, and we don't have to say it anymore. But we're not there yet. And so the way justice works is, if I've been working one muscle for very long, which is the muscle of Eurocentricity, the muscle of STEM classes being given priority, whatever that muscle is, the opposite muscle now needs to be worked out for a period of time. And that's exactly what the Black Lives Matter movement is really essentially saying. And then, just another example that I think relates very heavily to the issue of gender equity is this kidnapping plot that happened with Governor Whitmer recently is not just about the atrociousness of white supremacy and this and that, but it's also about the assumptions of gender inequity and the ability to go ahead and just kind of make assumptions. Why not any of the other governors, and why not any of the, and here we have this outspoken, incredible human being that is able to blend compassion and empathy with strength and wisdom and courage, and that of course becomes the target for men who have not yet willing to lean in. And so I see that the problem is not necessarily those men and that, but that they got through 12 years of school without being educated in the necessary qualities of cultural competency to be able to have to be challenged in the way they think and learn. Because remember, they're in schools, between 4 and 8 hours a day, depending upon, elementary and whatever. And they got through 12 years of school because and while we were teaching math and English and writing and whatever, we somehow or another didn't get to the cultural competency on gender equity and on gender values and virtues to allow them to get to the point that they were challenged on this, and it was not okay. So if you have large percentages of population that are incompetent, that are not learning cultural competency, you can't expect big changes in your culture, and so that's why I think we have to kind of prioritize.
Yeah, I think it's really demonstrated just in that phrase, that woman from Michigan,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, like with Michelle Obama and like President Obama and anybody that comes out that balances equity and compassion and empathy with courage and dignity and integrity, that becomes really threatening to those who kind of want business as usual, that want that patriarchy, that Eurocentricity, that all those qualities that we've just made assumptions of and haven't taught ourselves over. It really becomes threatening. And so we'll get to the fear component of this in just a second. But the degree the degree of our comfort to find and embrace and root out and heal implicit unconscious bias is an intelligence. And this is an intelligence that has to come to the forefront in education. If we don't make it come to the forefront, if cultural competency is not almost a prerequisite in all forms of education, we cannot expect differences in our society. So we come back to that discipline nonconformity. If we are not willing to be nonconformist in the way we teach and learn and move away from the industrial model of what we teach and learn, we can't expect differences. You know the definition of insanity, right? So why is this essential to educational reform? Yeah, I think it's clear. Once again, we can't expect something that we're not doing. And so I think that's why cultural competency is so incredible, even though it is a moving target, and none of us know what cultural competency actually should be, because we can't be that in our lifetime. It's going to take generations, as many generations as it took us to get here, in this place and space where we still allow racial hierarchies and gender hierarchies and privilege hierarchies and ability hierarchies. We have to basically undo that. And of course, that'll get back to our little friend Newton's law. So we'll come back to this in a bit. All right, so just a really quick thing. I want to just kind of put an emphasis on fear. Kind of the anti-justice and the anti-equity is this idea of fear, and we have to understand fear. And this is where we rely on psychology and sociology, and basically we rely on you folks to help us with this. The anger emotion switches on attitudes and behaviors which support confrontation. Fear, on the other hand, responds to anger by recalling fearful images, preparing the body for flight, and by signaling avoidance activity, directing the muscles to freeze or flee. So when we look at this kind of mindset as relates to cultural competency, fears are unwarranted, built on misinformation, and are imbalanced to actual history or the assets of a culture or group may have. They're harmful to us and those like us, so they help us reinforce our insiders. So we isolate and insulate ourselves with those that are insiders like us, because we feel more competent hanging around and hanging out with people that are more like us than not, rather than leaning into the fact that we have these biases, that they restrict our options and they help us, if they inflate our fears. And of course, the only way out of that is by hanging out with the people that are outsiders. So cultural competency actually demands, if we're going to overcome our fears, that we begin the process of normalizing hanging out with outsiders. Now, children, and this is why we come back to the children are ready to do this. Okay, you remember all our children at 4 years, 5 years old, you throw them in a room with people of different colors and whatever, and it's just something unique. In 5 seconds, they're over. They'll touch each other's hair, they'll touch each other's skin, they'll do that kind of thing, and then they're over it and they're out playing and it's over. And then progressively, of course, as they come into our classrooms and they come into and they're hearing these repetitive, non-competent mindsets being expressed by their elders, they begin to go ahead and pick up these barriers and these boundaries that obviously restrict their growth. So enough said on that. All right, now I normally would walk you through and just kind of show you there are basically 3 stages that we go through for cultural competency. So we have to actually start the process of defining this. This cannot remain an ambiguous concept, or we can't expect changes to actually occur. So the first thing is assessment. We have to know how to assess in open and honest terms what we know and what we don't know. So for every demographic, race, gender, ability, whatever, we have to be willing to take assessments that are made by the people who that is their superpower. Okay, and they basically go ahead and they say, okay, what do you know about this? What do you know about this? And they prioritize what everyone should know about themselves on their terms. And then by virtue of taking this assessment, we are able to go ahead and see, oh, on a continuum of 1 to 5, and I'll show you this continuum in a little bit, this is where I'm at, and I'm okay with that. And then, by the way, in the response to that, we nurture, but this is okay. In other words, if I had your life, I'd have that assessment too. Okay. And we have to normalize that. Then literacy is obviously informing ourselves based on what? And again, based on cultural self-determination. So I don't want a bunch of men deciding how we should become gender equitable, because I don't think necessarily we're going to get there. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious, but unfortunately, we're not doing that. I get to decide what I teach in my class, and that may not be necessarily the best thing for the things that are outside of my experience. And then the last thing, and this is particularly something that relies on that cultural humility, is service and immersion proficiency. We have to immerse ourselves in these cultures and with these demographics, and we have to normalize that in the constructs of our tenure and our promotion and everything, because this has to become kind of mainstream. And so you can see we got a little bit of a road ahead of us here. This is not something we're going to get to. So again, I reiterate, there's no outcome, there's no graduation, only professional engagement until our last breath. And then I remember Newton's law. It took us centuries to get here. It's going to take us centuries probably to get out of here. I'd like to say decades, but I'm not that confident it's going to be that quick. Yeah, maybe so. I'm going to quickly run through. This is something Michelle and I did last time. We did this, but I'm going to quickly run through how assessment works, just so you know that we've kind of thought this through. We have some models based on Native American and African American groups that we've started to formulate. But I also surround myself with quotes that remind me of the need for cultural nonconformity. So this particular quote is from prosperity for humankind, it is unrealistic to imagine that the vision of the next stage in the advancement of civilization can be formulated without a searching re-examination of the attitudes and assumptions that currently underlie approaches to social and economic development, and I include in that education. As it proceeds, however, fundamental issues will quickly emerge related to the social structures required, the implications for development and principles of social justice, and the nature and role of knowledge in effecting enduring change. Indeed, such a re-examination will be driven to seek a broad consensus of the understanding about human nature itself, and the very purpose of education, I might add to that. So I think what we're looking at is we've been educating people for jobs. We've been educating people for all those qualities that we put up earlier based on patriarchy and imperialism, competitive capitalism, and whatever. And so those are the muscles that are basically fully operational. And in order to be able to change how we teach and learn, and ultimately the quality of life for all of us, we'll have to begin to question these. And that's what cultural competency demands of us. All right, so I'm just going to quickly just say, what should we should have assessment and literacy. What should CC education look like? Well, it's not focusing mostly on content and standardized outcomes. It's those mindsets we talked about, particularly putting people of color and the people that are kind of in the back of the room, in the front of the room, creating and honoring self-assessment, cultural equity, and what was formerly called soft skills. I really hate that term, because I don't think if cultural humility and equity and justice are the most potentially needed qualities right now, that they can any longer be soft. I mean, what we're dealing with is not a lack of, we're not dealing with a lack of STEM right now. That is not really what's hurting the world right now. It is really what we call these mindsets and skill sets. And then the cultural assets that we recognize that if you give the keys of the car to women, or you give the keys of the car to African American or Native American and say, okay, you completely help us redesign how we look at psychology or how we teach music, we will see completely different standards of literacy and completely different standards of teaching and learning. A community or collectivist culture is going to teach in a collectivist mindset. And so that is completely different than an individualistic mindset. And then last, for educators, the potential we derive from nurturing cultural competency disciplined curriculum is ground zero for reform. I don't think we can do this without some nonconformity, or we're going to have to break some eggs to make this omelet, so to speak. All right, so if we were to do Native American culture, we'd see that we are the Native American culture. If we were to do cultural competency training here in the United States, I would start with Native cultures, mainly because percentage-wise, they are at the lowest percentage in virtually all studies. They are the least visible. They are the least recognized, and they are the least trained. I would create some assessments. We have some assessments that were actually made by Native American people, and they gave us questions, and you would assess, and you'd get point values based upon how you responded. Many of us that are fairly good at guessing answers are going to guess some of these, but unfortunately there's another competency assessment that you can't guess, and that is, how much time have you spent hanging out with Native American people? And here's where most of us are going to not do well, because we felt that we can intellectualize competency and that we can make claims of being competent when we're actually not hanging out and allowing those people from those cultures to have the keys to the car. Okay. And so when I do that for every competency dynamic, I basically factor this in as 50% of my assessment, and I'm going to come up on a scale of competency basically from culturally non-competent to culturally blind, culturally neutral, culturally competent, and eventually culturally proficient. Very few of us are going to end up in the cultural proficient category, because that requires an abundant amount of service and immersion in each of the cultures and demographics. But we can begin this process of starting to initiate this within the constructs, first of our teachers, of holding ourselves accountable and doing so lovingly, and like remembering we're all 5-year-olds with big adult bodies and the 5-year-old is perfectly okay of being wrong and not being there, whatever. The adult is always going to want to be authoritative and want to be in control, and so we have to work on this. Okay. All right, so I mentioned Newton's law. I just love this because to me, it's basically the understanding that there's only so much power in the world. There's only so much money. There's only so much positions, and you don't create justice by simply talking it. You actually have to act it out. We have to give people positions in power, and then we have to allow them to go ahead and help determine there. We have to step back if we're in the position of privilege. And so for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. For every historically evolved distortion, there is also the need for equal emphasis to do whatever is necessary to balance. So human consumption, patterns of history of value, constructs, climate change, all these things cannot be reversed if we don't understand that these are patterns that have evolved over thousands of years, and they're based upon mindsets of value and mindsets of lifestyle. And in order to undo that, we have to begin the teaching cultural competency around different values. And it's wonderful to reduce our carbon footprint, but that isn't going to change, consumerism. It's not going to change patriarchy. It's not going to change competitive capitalism. And that's the basis by which money kind of overtakes almost everything else, okay, including our planet. I'm editorializing here to try to get through these. So if I'm overstating things, feel free to call me out on this. But all right, so again, human consumption, historically evolved beliefs of gender, patriarchy, educating the eradication of gender inequity. All these things are going to require an enormous amount of emphasis on the other side to build up that muscle, and people have to lean into that, and particularly people that are in the majority or privileged group. All right, so I'm going to move on. So just really quickly, if we look at a multicultural education and prioritizing DEJI, I would say the practice and practice of what we call differentiation in societies, if we don't improve cultures, basically what we need is a form of differentiation. Carol Tomlinson is the person who coined this term. Differentiation includes multiple intelligences. It includes diverse cultural assets. It includes the belief that intelligence is diverse, like Carol Dweck also says, but that we have to teach this differentiation in the constructs of our education. It also requires the deconstruction of racial, cultural, and gender hierarchies, and of culture, and also kind of a balance to cultural centricity and exceptionalism. And I'm going to just kind of move on from there. So basically, we have to reevaluate our priorities. When I talk about cultural literacy, so the next phase after assessment is cultural literacy. We begin to build up literacy banks that are again made by people that is their superpower. And the literacy banks have to have all the variety of learning mechanisms that humans have intelligence. So there needs to be music, there needs to be podcasts, there needs to be books, there needs to be articles, there needs to be everything. We can't just simply stay in the realm of cognitive intelligence, which is how we've defined intelligence for centuries. We have to be able to allow people to be able to engage these topics based on their intelligence. If somebody learns better through a TED Talk or a music video, then we need to have those included in the anti-racism, anti-gender bias, anti-whatever it is, resources that are made up and also weighted and reviewed by the people who that is their superpower. And that's how we begin to go ahead and increase cultural competency, is that we have these banks. I can't be making those decisions for someone else because I'm not culturally competent in any area but my own kind of like background. All right, so I'm going to just tell a little story, and then I think we're probably pretty much out of time. So all the other nice little ideas I had are going to just go by the wayside, which is perfectly fine because I've been talking too much anyway. So I'm going to just quickly talk about a story, and to me this is the final phase, which is immersion. Immersion learning is being willing to go ahead and hang out with people on their terms and recognize that oral histories and stories, listening to our elders, needs to be included in our educational literacy banks and also in our classrooms. Because if Sherry, if Michelle, if you and I, if the three of us all publish papers and things like this on what cultural competency is and whatever, and the people that read that say, yeah, this is cultural competency, all right, we're missing all the voices of the people who may be, in fact, more culturally competent, but do not choose to publish and do not choose to do things the way we do. And so all of these myriad of histories and backgrounds and life experiences are missing. So I'm going to tell you a quick story here, just kind of how I evolved, and then I guess this will be it, because this is one of the most profound ways that an immersion experience I had converted into a complete change in the way I teach and learn, and kind of set me on this process. This is Kevin Locke. He's Lakota Sioux. And so I was doing a tour, and I was at a world music event. I'm going to play some music him. This is him playing a flute, so I'm going to put this in the background. Whoops, if I can even do it. So I'm at this big thing, and I'm doing this concert and whatever, and we're all thinking we're all that, and people are applauding and whatever. And then this guy gets out, And he starts telling this story about his grandfather, and then particularly about his mother. And he told this huge long story about mother, and then he did this song called Midnight Strongheart, which is what you're listening to. And he talked about the fact that women have this greater moral courage. And then he talked about the fact that because women think in the world of the circular vision, or at least in native cultures, everything is based on the circle, they're able to be inclusive of all visions and all viewpoints and whatever. And I just thought this was profound. I had no idea, frankly, what he was talking about. But at that point, I was convinced I was going to be, I had my PhD, and I was going to be on the American Anthropology Society, and I was a professor at Wayne State University, and I was going to publish and this and that. I had this vision. I was going to go ahead, and I was doing my, I'm going to be on the committee, and I was on the committee for a national conference. And I said, why don't we invite this guy and have him be a speaker? Which should say something, because this was 1991, and it was the first time we invited a Native American to the American Anthropological Society to speak. So that already says something about cultural arrogance, doesn't it? It's like, dude, all right. So we all gave our papers, and of course, the standard of reading papers at a conference is everybody, we stack it with all the quotes and all the thing, and it's kind of a bit of a competition of sorts to prove that our vision and view is kind of the best or most informed. Okay, and I'm not saying everybody does it that way, but I'm going to say I was doing it that way. Okay, all right. So we all got done, and people applauded, and I was feeling pretty good, pretty self-righteous. And then he gets up, and he starts playing this flute. Didn't say a thing. Plays the flute and bows to the 7 directions. Now that was news to me. I thought there were 4. Okay, north, south, east, west, Mother Earth, the world of the ancestors, and then he finished playing, and he put his flute on his heart, which is the human soul. And then he started talking about his grandfather and related it to Father Bear. And then he talked about his mother, okay? And he talked about, the moral courage of women and whatever. And he was just telling this story, but it was like going on, and everybody was like enamored, and all these people with PhDs had been trying to take notes, and they stopped taking notes, and they just like looked. And then he just got to the end after about 20 minutes, and he stopped. And he said, thank you. And he walked off. And nobody knew what he was talking about. So I went up on behalf of the conference and basically was saying, so what did that mean? What was the outcome? And he said, you come from the world of the square, and I come from the world of the circle. That didn't sound really positive. You're a square, I'm a circle. But then he said, think of it. You get up in the morning and you're on what shaped bed? You look at your ceiling, it's what shape. Your doors and your windows are what shape. Your walls are what shape. You plant your crops in what shape. Your yards are laid out in what shape. Your streets are laid out in what shape. And he goes on and on and on. And so I go, okay, still puzzled. And he said, but if you live that way, how do you think you think? So he grabbed my paper, because remember, he had none. And he grew a thing and says, when you write a paper or give a talk, what do? And I said, well, we start with a thesis. He says, yes, and you do 1 line. And then he said, and then what do you do? Well, we support it. And he said, yes, you support it with the artifacts of your culture. And you do 2 lines. And then he said, and what do you do at the end? And we come up with a conclusion, usually a singular outcome. And he finished it. And he said, that is the construct of or, as in it's this or this. It's monolithic or it's dualistic. It's you're right or you're wrong. Okay? And that's the world you live in. It's argumentative. Then he drew a circle, and he said, in our world, everyone's vision is part of the truth. And without everyone's vision, you can't arrive at truth. So you don't argue your vision, you give your vision to the community. It belongs to the community. You don't own it. Remember, Native Americans didn't believe in ownership? That's kind of how they got taken over, because the cultures that came here did believe in ownership. And so imperialism is this mindset that relates to cultural imperialism, and everything we do is patterned off that mindset. The world of the circle is the world that will heal racism. It will heal gender bias. It will allow us to build learning communities that are not based on a patriarchal authority or based on the cultural mindsets that we've been carrying forward for centuries. It'll be based on empathy, it'll be based on justice, and it'll be based on inclusivity.
It was great. Thank you.
No, no, that's good. And I ended right on time. I'm so proud of myself. I've never done anything on time. Okay, do you guys want to say anything or add anything or subtract anything?
So interestingly, I actually had a question, but I sort of feel like I don't want to leave off of that story. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't want to redirect
No,
it
no, no,
back
no. Go ahead,
because
go ahead, go ahead.
that was actually really powerful. I appreciated that. Um, the question comes to me um, when I surround myself with other academics or even my students who have come to me hopefully with an open mind and receptiveness. I find it easy to model what you've talked about, the humility that I don't know
Right.
all of this. I'm in my process as well, and all of that. I want to model that. However, I find myself many times in an environment with people who are not, and they will use that humility or my willingness to model dialogue. Um, they actually use it against you and actually say, well, look at how unevolved you are, that you don't even know. And actually, I'm like, actually, I think it's slightly more evolved to open your mind and be willing to say. I mean, I don't know how to deal with that.
So you are saying precisely why we need to become non-conformists and build alternate worlds, because we need to build learning communities where, so that is getting back to qualities of empathy and cultural humility, getting back to the qualities of mothers and women, getting back to the qualities of collectivist societies. What you are modeling is laying your reality out on your shirt sleeve, and so that other people can learn from that humility and whatever. And what you're getting back is thousands of years of this kind of patriarchal mindset and this um, uh, monolithic vision of truth and value, and saying, it's that one-upmanship, that competitive value, and they're pressing you and saying you're the one that's like wrong. And so again, we can work within and try to go ahead and move people as much as we can within the systems that exist. But just know that as long as the systems work along the values and the constructs that we've inherited over thousands of years, humility and growth mindset and equity are not going to get the greatest push. If, however, we begin to go ahead and create an alternative universe for that, and that universe begins to exercise this other muscle or these other muscles, we can start to feel like we're not the ones that are in left field anymore. We surround ourselves with others who want to go ahead and place those values in a stronger position. We begin to create research around that. We begin to reinforce assessments and class infrastructures that model those principles. And all of a sudden, we're not alone anymore. And those characteristics begin to rise to the top. Zoom. Yeah. If I were to go ahead and do anything and put it in the circle, I would begin the process as an example of taking almost every paradigm I'm teaching and begin to go ahead and include multiple truths. So as an example, if we were to heal racism, we would have to put all the different focuses and values that go into the need for healing racism into that circle. And although you may not be able to see it, this is kind of mine. And I put the arrows of kind of where I started, and then recognize that as we evolve in competency, we're going to shift in terms of our priorities. Like if you've never hung out with somebody of a different race or of a different background or whatever, and you've never really immersed yourself, you're going to start with, oh, your hair is different. You're in culturally blind and incompetency, to begin with. And then we have to okay that and make that be kind of like normal, and then eventually we kind of move up and we include more circles and more characteristics and traits. So I think that the thing that I would basically just end with is, I think we need to continue to work on building a learning community around cultural competency education. I think it needs to be interdisciplinary. I think as long as we're in our little departments and our little areas, it's really hard to get the psychiatrists and the sociologists and the artists and the musicians and the educators and everybody into the same room. I don't think that you can solve a problem with a single discipline without going back to the way that discipline works. And again, I think it has to be something that we have to kind of prioritize. And so the only beauty of that is to begin to continue to try to have this dialogue. So, hopefully, we'll find ways of doing that. I'm going to end it now because I have to, because it's right at the